"Stop her," the Alpha King said when he noticed the blind Omega dancing alone by the throne. The throne room stretched wide and cold, its high ceiling swallowed by shadow, and torches flickered like restless spirits along the walls. The air smelled of old stone and lingering incense, and the sound of distant footsteps echoed faintly through the hall. At the far end, a figure moved alone, swaying and spinning in quiet grace. She was small, delicate, yet every movement carried a strange power, as though she could command the air itself. Lyra, the blind Omega, danced without music, without a sound, yet every motion seemed to match the rhythm of a heartbeat she alone could feel. Her dark hair brushed her shoulders with each turn, and the folds of her simple gown flowed like liquid shadow around her. She could not see the gold of the throne, the banners fluttering above it, or the courtiers who dared not approach her. Yet she felt everything, the tension in the air, the weight of gazes, the silent fear of those who watched. Atop the throne, King Kalen, the Alpha King, sat like a storm held in stillness. His sharp eyes were trained on Lyra, though his posture betrayed a restless tension. He was a man feared across the kingdom, a ruler whose word could bend armies and whose anger could break lives. And yet, as he watched her dance, a curiosity stirred in him that he had not felt in years. There was something about her, something fragile yet unyielding, that tugged at a part of him he had long hidden beneath iron and duty. "Stop her," he commanded, his voice low, almost unwilling, yet carrying the weight of command. The court froze. His soldiers and servants glanced at one another, hesitant. No one had dared oppose him, yet Lyra was not like other people. To command her was not simple, and she did not stop. Lyra moved as if she heard his words, felt them brush against her skin like wind on water, but she did not halt. She spun again, her bare feet brushing the cold stone floor, her hands rising like tendrils reaching for something unseen. She danced not for the court, not for the king, but for herself, and perhaps for the whispers that only she could hear. Kalen's jaw tightened. He had ruled his kingdom with discipline and precision, yet this Omega challenged him without even speaking. She held a power he did not understand, a subtle strength, a courage born of knowing fear and still moving forward. "Bring her to me," he said again, louder this time. The guards stepped forward, their boots echoing in the silent hall. But Lyra shifted, spinning faster, her movements suddenly unpredictable, almost as if the hall itself bent to her will. The soldiers faltered, unsure how to approach, as if an invisible wall of something unseen kept them back. Kalen's eyes narrowed. He rose from the throne, his cloak sweeping behind him like midnight. He descended the steps slowly, deliberately, each movement commanding attention. Lyra's dance faltered slightly, sensing the presence of the Alpha approaching, not with fear, but with the recognition of another force unlike herself. "You should not be here," Kalen said finally, his voice carrying through the hall like a gust of wind. "You are not meant to dance before a throne." Lyra stopped spinning but did not turn. Her head tilted slightly, and her lips curved into the faintest smile, though she did not speak. "I am not here for the throne," she whispered, her voice soft yet certain, though no one could hear her clearly except the king himself. "I am here for the silence that listens." Kalen froze at her words. They were strange, enigmatic, almost maddening in their simplicity. He had heard many words in his life, pleas, threats, lies, confessions, but never such a declaration of quiet strength. He stepped closer, and with every step, the tension between them grew. The guards held their positions, unwilling to intrude on this strange duel of wills. "You feel too much," Kalen said, finally breaking the silence. "You hear too much, you see what others cannot." Lyra's lips curved again, a ghost of a smile. "Perhaps it is not what I see or hear," she said softly, "but what I choose to listen to." Kalen's hand tightened into a fist at his side. She was challenging him, not openly, not with defiance, but with a calm certainty that unsettled him. He had faced invaders, traitors, and monsters beyond imagining, But this blind Omega, dancing alone in the throne room, made him feel human, vulnerable in a way he had long buried beneath authority and power. A sudden movement from Lyra drew his eyes. She extended her arms, spinning again, and whispered a name that he recognized instantly. It was a name from his past, one that carried pain, loss, and regret. His chest tightened, a sharp pang that reminded him of the boy he once was, before the crown, before the throne, before the years of solitude and command. "Kalen," she breathed, almost like a sigh, and the sound lingered in the air between them. The court held its collective breath. Whispers passed like ghosts through the hall, yet no one dared speak aloud. The king's face, usually unreadable, betrayed the faintest crack of emotion. He stepped closer, drawn despite himself, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. She was blind, yes, but in her blindness she had seen more than anyone else ever could. "Why do you speak my name?" he asked, his voice low, almost broken. Lyra's dance slowed, her movements deliberate now. She raised her hands as though she could touch the truth itself, and in that motion Kalen felt something shift. She was not weak. She was not afraid. She was calling him, challenging him, holding him accountable to something he had long denied. "You cannot stop what is already moving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it resonated deep in his chest. "I am not yours to command, nor anyone else's." The king's jaw tightened. He had ruled with law, with power, with fear, and yet all of it felt meaningless here. The throne was a seat of command, but it could not command this Omega. Not fully, not in the way that mattered. Kalen took another step forward, and the court seemed to shrink away from them, leaving only the two figures in the vast, torchlit hall. Lyra's senses guided her, and she did not flinch. She could not see him, but she could feel his presence, the rhythm of his heart, the tension coiled like steel around his shoulders. "You are dangerous," Kalen said finally, his voice almost a growl. "Not to the throne, but to me." Lyra's smile faded slightly, replaced with a look of quiet understanding. She extended her hand just once toward him, not to touch, but to acknowledge the unspoken link forming between them. The king's heart pounded. He had never encountered someone who could both command his attention and unnerve him without a single strike or word of malice. Lyra had done it simply by being herself, blind, yet seeing more than anyone else in the room. Suddenly, from the shadows at the edge of the hall, a servant whispered something hurriedly. Kalen turned his head sharply, the moment of vulnerability breaking, but his eyes remained fixed on Lyra. "Do not dance again," he said, his voice lower this time, almost a plea. "Not until I understand why." Lyra tilted her head, as if considering him, then began to move again. Slowly at first, then faster, her feet brushing the stone floor in patterns only she could hear. Her dance was no longer simply motion. It was defiance. It was strength. It was a challenge he could not refuse. Kalen's chest ached with a strange mix of anger and fascination. Every instinct in him demanded control, yet every impulse whispered that he could not, and perhaps should not, attempt to control her. She spun again, and this time whispered another name, a name he had thought buried in the past, a memory he had tried to forget. His hand twitched, almost reaching for her, but the words caught in his throat. The throne room seemed to shrink around them, the torches flickering as though they, too, were mesmerized. Lyra's presence filled every corner, every shadow, every silence. She was not just a blind Omega, she was a force of will, and she had chosen this moment to make him see what he had long ignored. The king took a step closer, unable to resist the pull between them. His voice softened, almost breaking. "Lyra, why do you haunt me so?" She did not answer. She did not need to. Her dance spoke louder than any words. It was a language of longing, of challenge, of truth that could not be denied. And in that moment, Kalen understood that the throne, the kingdom, the laws he had built his life around, they all meant nothing in the face of the Omega who danced alone before him. The court held its breath. Outside, the wind whispered through the stone corridors. Inside, the king and the Omega faced each other, their hearts echoing in a silent rhythm that neither could escape. Lyra spun once more, her gown flowing like liquid night, and for a fleeting heartbeat, it seemed the world itself paused to watch. Kalen's eyes burned with a strange fire, fear, fascination, and longing all at once. "I will not let you go," he said, almost to himself, and yet the words were heavy with both threat and desire. Lyra's smile returned, gentle but unreadable. She did not stop and she did not turn. She danced, knowing that the king had noticed, knowing that something unspoken had begun. And as the echoes of her steps faded into the stone halls, Kalen realized with sudden, undeniable clarity, he was no longer a king in control. He was a man caught in the orbit of a blind Omega, whose dance could undo him, whose presence could break him, and whose secret strength might just save him. The throne room held its silence, the courtiers frozen, the torches flickering. And in the silence, only one truth remained. The story had only begun. The halls beneath the throne were dark, narrow, and cold. Candles flickered in small iron sconces, casting long, trembling shadows that danced along the walls. Lyra moved carefully, her bare feet brushing the stone floor with practiced grace. She had escaped the eyes of the court, yet she knew she could not escape the king entirely. Kalen's command still echoed in her mind. "Stop her." It was a simple order, yet it carried an urgency that she could feel pressing against her like a storm. She did not fear him. Fear was not hers to hold. But she understood that the king's eyes were not easily turned away once he had noticed someone. As she moved through the labyrinthine corridors, Lyra sensed the presence of guards trailing her. Their boots were quiet but steady, their rhythm betraying their intent. She smiled faintly. She could not see, but she could feel the patterns of footsteps, the shift of weight in the air, the almost imperceptible tension that clung to anyone who followed her. Kalen's voice, low and deliberate, called out from somewhere behind. "Lyra!" The single name resonated through the stone corridors. The sound was neither harsh nor cruel, yet it carried a weight that made her pause. She continued moving, guiding herself by memory and intuition, until she reached a small, arched doorway at the end of a corridor. Here, the shadows seemed to deepen, curling like smoke, and she slipped through, leaving her pursuers momentarily behind. Kalen, though, did not give up. He descended from the throne room quietly, his cloak brushing the steps with the precision of a predator. He moved with the ease of a man who had spent decades mastering control over both men and circumstance, yet each step brought him closer to uncertainty. He had never encountered anyone like her, not someone so fragile, and yet so impossible to subdue. He found her in a narrow chamber lined with tapestries and the faint scent of old flowers. Lyra was standing still, her hands brushing the walls as if listening to the whispers trapped in the threads. She had sensed him before he stepped fully into the room. There was a faint smile on her lips, gentle and knowing. "You cannot hide from me," Kalen said, his voice low, even now carrying that strange mix of command and curiosity. Lyra turned slightly, tilting her head toward the sound of his voice. "I do not hide," she whispered. "I move where I am needed, and I move alone." Kalen's sharp eyes followed her, studying every slight movement, every measured gesture. "Alone," he repeated. "You have no idea what dangers lie in these halls." "I do not fear danger," she said simply, though the words were more than just a claim. They were a shield, a truth that protected her from both the world and from him. "I fear only the chains placed upon me by those who cannot understand me." Kalen stepped closer, and for the first time, Lyra did not retreat. She felt his presence as if it were a warm wind brushing against her skin, something unavoidable yet strangely comforting. She had heard the whispers about him, a man ruthless and unyielding, a ruler whose enemies vanished before dawn. And yet here he was, hesitant, caught off guard by something as simple and impossible as her dance. You speak of chains, Kalen said, his voice softening despite himself. And yet you move freely even in the face of my command. Lyra smiled faintly. Freedom is not always given, my king. Sometimes it must be taken, step by step, choice by choice. The words struck him harder than any sword ever could. Kalen had spent a lifetime bending the world to his will, and yet this Omega, blind, unassuming, and yet wholly certain of herself, spoke as if he were the one who needed to learn. He tried again, taking a step closer, more assertive now. Do you not know your place in my kingdom? You are under my protection, whether you understand it or not. Lyra's hands lifted, and Kalen noticed how precise her gestures were, like threads of air she could shape with her mind alone. Protection is not the same as control, she said. You may guard my life, but you may not claim my heart or my will. The words were a gentle challenge, yet the tension between them thickened the air. Kalen's jaw tightened. For the first time in decades, he was aware that strength was not always measured in armies or power, but in courage and in the refusal to submit. You are dangerous, he said finally, his voice low, almost a growl. Not to my throne, not to my kingdom, but to me. Lyra tilted her head, feeling the subtle vibrations of the stone floor beneath them. And yet, she said, you are drawn to me. Kalen froze. The words, though simple, rang with undeniable truth. He could not deny the pull he felt toward her, a mixture of fascination, challenge, and something deeper he had long ignored, longing. A sudden sound from the hallway interrupted the moment. Footsteps approached, cautious, hesitant. Kalen's instincts went immediately to command, but Lyra's voice, soft and calm, held him back. They are not the ones I fear, she whispered. It was then that Kalen noticed the subtle magic in her presence. He had heard of the old stories, of curses and gifts passed through bloodlines, but he had never seen proof. Yet here it was, tangible, quiet, and undeniable. Lyra could feel the intentions of those who followed her, sense the danger before it came. She could navigate a world built on sight without ever needing to see. Kalen studied her. He had ruled kingdoms, fought wars, and faced creatures of myth and shadow. Yet this Omega, blind and alone, could unnerve him with a single gesture, a single phrase. And in that realization, something fragile began to bloom within him, a mix of respect, fascination, and a strange, tender concern he had not felt in years. You are no ordinary Omega, he said finally, almost reverently. You are something more. Lyra's hands rested lightly against the stone wall, tracing the contours with practiced care. Perhaps, she said softly, I am only what the world has allowed me to become. Kalen took another step closer, and the energy between them shifted. He was a king, used to control, used to power, yet he felt powerless before her. He longed to reach out, to take her hand, to understand her, but something restrained him. A respect, a fear, a recognition that she was not meant to be commanded. You will come with me, he said at last, firm but gentle. Not as a prisoner, not as a subject, but as someone I must protect. You do not yet understand the dangers that seek you in this world. Lyra paused, feeling the sincerity in his tone. She did not move immediately, sensing the invisible threads of fate that seemed to bind them together. And yet she did not resist. Not fully. Not yet. I will go with you, she said finally, her voice calm, steady, yet carrying the weight of a quiet defiance. But only as long as I move as I choose, and only as long as my steps are my own. Kalen nodded. He knew she was testing him, seeing whether he could respect her freedom while still offering protection. It was a delicate balance, one he had never had to strike before. And he realized, with an odd mixture of fear and anticipation, that the dance between them had only just begun. Together, they moved through the corridors, Kalen walking slightly ahead, yet not fully leading. Lyra followed, guided by intuition, by feeling, by the subtle vibrations in the air. The halls seemed alive with their presence, the shadows twisting and bending as if recognizing the unspoken tension between them. You feel things that others cannot, Kalen said quietly after a long silence. I have seen fear, betrayal, and loyalty in soldiers and ministers alike, yet you see deeper. You feel what they hide and what they deny. Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile. I do not see deeper than others, she said. I simply listen to the silence that others ignore. The world speaks in quiet ways and only some know how to hear it. Kalen was silent for a long moment, absorbing her words. He had spent a lifetime ruling with certainty. Yet here was a woman who existed outside certainty, who challenged him with every step, and yet drew him closer without even trying. Finally, they reached a small chamber at the edge of the palace, lit with faint candlelight and lined with cushions and soft rugs. It was a hidden room, rarely used, a place of quiet and safety. Kalen gestured for her to enter. Rest here, he said gently. I will remain nearby. No harm will come to you while I am near. Lyra stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the room, and allowed herself a small measure of relief. For the first time since she had entered the throne room, she felt seen, not just noticed but understood in some way, even if partially. Kalen stayed just outside the doorway, leaning against the frame. He did not fully relax, for he knew that the danger surrounding them was not yet past. Yet in that moment he allowed himself to feel something long buried, something fragile and human, the stirrings of concern, admiration, and perhaps longing. The candles flickered, casting long shadows, and Lyra's presence seemed to hum with quiet power. Kalen realized that this Omega, blind yet more aware than anyone he had ever known, was not just a threat or a challenge. She was a force of change, one that might transform him, and perhaps the kingdom itself, in ways he could not yet imagine. And as the quiet settled over the hidden chamber, both King and Omega sensed it. Their paths were now intertwined. The dance that had begun in the throne room was far from over. Outside, the corridors whispered with secrets, and unseen forces stirred, sensing the unusual bond forming between them. Kalen's voice, quiet and almost reluctant, carried through the stone walls. I will not let you walk alone in this world, Lyra. Not now, not ever. Lyra tilted her head slightly, sensing the sincerity, yet still wary. She did not reply immediately. Instead, she listened, her heart and mind attuned to the rhythms around her, waiting to see whether this king could truly honor her freedom while walking beside her. And somewhere deep within the palace, in shadows unseen, a whisper of danger began to move, a presence drawn to the strength between the Alpha King and the blind Omega. Their story, had only just begun. The sun had disappeared behind the clouds, and the kingdom was swallowed by a crimson eclipse. Its dull, eerie light filtered through the high windows of the throne room, painting the walls in shades of blood and shadow. Every stone seemed to hum with tension, and the air felt heavy, as if the world itself held its breath. Lyra stood near the edge of the throne room, her hands tracing the air as if she could feel what others could not see. Though blind, she perceived the change in the atmosphere, a presence that was dark and ancient, yet subtle like a snake coiled in the grass. She whispered a single word to herself, a warning she could not yet name aloud. Kalen entered quietly, his cloak brushing the floor. The Alpha King's eyes were sharp, scanning the shadows as though he could see the invisible threads of danger lurking just beyond sight. Lyra turned slightly, sensing his approach without looking. You feel it, she said softly. Something is moving in the kingdom. Something old, and it does not welcome us. Kalen's jaw tightened. I have felt it, he admitted. It is not like anything we have faced. No army, no invader. This is darker, more patient, waiting. Lyra nodded. And it has chosen this moment. Her voice was calm, steady, yet carried the weight of certainty. We cannot face it alone. Kalen stepped closer, his presence filling the space beside her. He had spent years commanding armies and making impossible decisions, yet he felt powerless in the face of her insight. She was more than an Omega. She was a force that saw through shadows, even those invisible to him. Then we face it together, he said firmly, side by side. Her hand brushed against his arm, light, almost accidental, yet deliberate enough to make his pulse catch. Kalen looked down at her, trying to mask the sudden tension that ran through him. He had fought countless battles, but the silent pull between them, their hearts responding to each other, was far more dangerous than any army or curse. The sound of shifting stone echoed through the hall, faint but deliberate. Lyra's head tilted slightly. "They come," she whispered. Kalen's hand went instinctively to the hilt of his sword, but he paused, realizing that steel alone would not defeat this. Whatever waited for them was beyond mortal strength. He glanced at Lyra, who moved to the center of the room, her posture calm, commanding, yet somehow vulnerable. From the shadows emerged forms that shimmered like mist. Their shapes were human, yet twisted, unnatural. They moved as one, silent, gliding across the floor without hesitation. The courtiers who remained hidden behind columns stifled screams, but Lyra did not flinch. She felt their intent, their hunger for power, their hunger for fear, and met it with something stronger, her own courage and the clarity of heart that no darkness could touch. Kalen drew his sword, but he did not advance recklessly. He had learned that brute force could not overcome all things. Instead, he watched her, studying how she moved through space, sensing without sight, weaving through shadows as though the hall itself guided her. "Move closer to me," he said quietly, almost a whisper. Lyra obeyed, though she did not step behind him. Instead, she moved beside him, her awareness extending to the corners of the throne room. Together, they formed a single presence, two different strengths united by circumstance. The creatures advanced, their shapes flickering like smoke in the dim light. Lyra extended her hands, and Kalen noticed a faint glow surrounding her fingertips. It was subtle, barely noticeable, yet it pushed the shadows back, slowing the advance of the intruders. "They are drawn to fear," Lyra said calmly. "Do not give them any. Do not let them see weakness." Kalen's eyes met hers. "Then we fight as one," he said, and he felt her agreement in the rhythm of her movements, in the quiet strength that radiated from her despite her blindness. The creatures lunged, and Kalen moved with precision, striking where he could. Yet it was Lyra who guided them, sensing openings, predicting their paths, and creating barriers with gestures that seemed impossible to him. For every step she took, the shadows recoiled, as though acknowledging her power. "You are extraordinary," Kalen said under his breath, a mixture of awe and disbelief in his voice. Lyra did not answer immediately. Her attention was fully focused, her every motion deliberate, flowing with rhythm that seemed both natural and magical. "I am what the world allowed me to become," she said finally, her voice steady, though Kalen felt its weight in his chest. "And sometimes the world allows more than we expect." The creatures withdrew momentarily, as if regrouping. Kalen saw an opening and lunged forward, but Lyra's hand caught his arm, stopping him. "Not yet," she said softly. "Wait for the rhythm, follow my steps. Do not force what the moment cannot hold." Kalen took a breath and trusted her. He had always been a man of action, decisive and commanding, yet here he learned patience, learning to move in harmony with someone else's rhythm rather than his own. It was humbling, frustrating, and exhilarating. Lyra moved to the center, spinning slowly, her hands raised. The faint glow around her fingertips grew brighter, illuminating the room with a soft, ethereal light. The shadows shrank back, hesitant now. Kalen watched in fascination as she chanted words in a language he did not know, yet the vibrations resonated through his chest. The creatures faltered, their forms trembling as if caught between two worlds. Lyra's power, subtle yet undeniable, was not only guiding them but commanding the darkness itself to pause. Kalen stepped beside her, sword ready, but increasingly aware that this battle required more than strength, it required trust. "We cannot fail," he said quietly. "If they break through the kingdom," Lyra's hand rested briefly on his shoulder. "We will not fail," she whispered. "Together." A sudden, violent surge shook the hall. One of the creatures broke through, moving faster than the others. Kalen lunged, but it was Lyra who intercepted it, her awareness predicting its movement. The creature recoiled, confused by her presence, and Kalen struck, driving it back into the shadows. They fought as a single unit, their movements intertwined, their strengths complementing each other. And as they battled, Kalen felt something he had not in years, a bond not of command, not of duty, but of mutual reliance, respect, and an unspoken connection that neither could deny. But even as they pressed the advantage, a deeper shadow stirred in the corner of the room, unseen until it was almost too late. It was larger than the others, ancient and patient, radiating a presence that chilled the soul. Lyra sensed it immediately, her hands trembling slightly, yet her stance did not falter. "They are not all here," she whispered. "Something waits, watching." Kalen's sword tensed in his grip. He had faced many threats, yet this presence carried something beyond danger. It carried judgment, waiting to strike at the hearts of those who dared challenge it. The room fell silent for a moment, the creatures frozen in hesitation, the torch flames flickering violently. Lyra extended her hands, sensing the pulse of this greater force. Kalen stepped closer, instinctively shielding her, even though she needed no protection. "It wants more than our bodies," Lyra whispered. "It wants our fear, our doubt." Kalen's chest tightened. He had lived a life guided by strategy, control, and dominance. He had never encountered a force that thrived not on strength, but on the weakness of the heart. And yet, he realized, it was not the creatures outside that threatened them most. It was the uncertainty within themselves. Lyra reached out, and for the first time, Kalen saw her face fully illuminated by the soft glow of her power. Even blind, her eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, looking into him, into himself, and into the world that had long hidden its truths from both of them. "You are not alone," she said softly, "and neither am I. Together we are more than they can face." Kalen felt a surge of emotion he could not name. Pride, fear, respect, longing, they all collided in his chest. He had spent a lifetime believing that power alone was enough to command the world. But now he understood that true strength came from trust, from unity, from the bond between two souls willing to face darkness together. The larger shadow advanced, and Lyra took a deep breath. Kalen mirrored her stance, stepping close, letting her intuition guide their movements. For the first time, he moved not as a king commanding his subjects, but as a man standing beside someone he could not fully understand, yet completely trusted. The shadow surged forward and Lyra spun, her hands tracing arcs of light in the air. Kalen followed her rhythm, striking and blocking, moving in a pattern that was no longer just his own. The hall seemed to bend around them, the shadows writhing, the eclipse light bathing everything in red. Then, with a sudden roar of energy, the shadow paused, hesitated, and finally recoiled, as if unable to face the unity of the king and the Omega standing together. Kalen felt the tension in the air ease slightly, though the presence remained silent, patient, biding its time. Lyra exhaled softly, stepping closer to Kalen. "We have won this moment," she whispered, "but not the war." Kalen nodded, sheathing his sword. His eyes met hers, and in them he saw not fear but determination, not defiance but trust. And for the first time he realized that the bond between them, fragile, dangerous, yet undeniable, was their greatest strength. "You saved me," Kalen said quietly, his voice almost a murmur. Lyra shook her head slightly, a faint smile touching her lips. "No," she said, "we saved each other." Outside, in the darkness of the throne room, unseen eyes stirred once more. The larger shadow had not vanished. It had only withdrawn, waiting, watching, planning. The story was far from over, and Kalen and Lyra's bond, though stronger now, would soon be tested beyond anything they had faced. For now, though, they stood together, side by side, the light of trust and courage between them a small beacon against the encroaching darkness. And in that moment, The Alpha King and the blind Omega understood something essential. The greatest battles were not fought with swords alone, but with hearts willing to face the unknown together. The crimson eclipse deepened, casting long shadows across the hall, and a whisper of prophecy echoed in the air. The dance had only begun, and the throne of thorns awaited. The ruins of the palace lay under a pale dawn, gray light spilling across fractured towers and collapsed walls. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, mixed with the faint scent of flowers crushed beneath rubble. Silence hung heavy, yet it was a fragile peace. Every shadow seemed to hide a memory of the battles fought and sacrifices made. Lyra moved carefully among the ruins, her bare feet brushing against cracked stones. She had felt it from the moment she left the throne room, the heartbeat of the kingdom, wounded but alive, calling out to her. Kaelin had been separated during the chaos, swallowed by the shadows when a force far older than either of them struck. Her heart, though steady, pounded with worry she could not hide. She paused, closing her eyes as if to see through the memory of the land itself. Her hands hovered over broken pillars, feeling the traces of energy that lingered like echoes. Something deep inside her whispered a direction. A pulse, faint yet steady, guided her steps, Kaelin's pulse. "He is here," she murmured to herself, and moved faster, weaving through the rubble with a grace that belied the destruction around her. The kingdom had been scarred, yet she could feel life stubbornly clinging to stone and air. She had survived because she had learned to listen to the world beneath her senses. Now she listened for him. Kaelin's voice came first, a low groan carried on the wind. He had been trapped under a collapsed archway, his body battered but alive. The sunlight struck him and he blinked against it, seeing for the first time that the palace was no longer whole. His pride and composure were bruised along with his body, yet he refused to cry out. He knew she would find him. "Kaelin," Lyra's voice called softly but firmly, echoing across the ruins. He turned, and a faint smile touched his lips, though exhaustion weighed heavily on him. He knew she had come, guided by her own inner sight, her unerring sense of presence. Lyra knelt beside him, lifting pieces of stone to free him. Her hands were gentle, precise, moving as though she could feel the exact weight and angle of each fragment. "You are alive," she said softly, almost in wonder. "I knew you would be. I felt it." Kaelin reached for her hand, steadying himself against her presence. The connection between them was no longer subtle. It had grown into something undeniable, a tether that could not be broken by distance or danger. "I would have waited for you," he said quietly, "even if it took an eternity." Lyra's lips curved into a small smile. "We survive because we move together," she said, and her words carried the truth of every challenge they had faced. Not alone, never alone. The ruins around them seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Even the wind stilled for a moment, acknowledging the bond forming between King and Omega. Kaelin stood, leaning slightly on her shoulder for support, but the strength that had once come solely from his crown now seemed shared, reinforced by trust, courage, and something far deeper. A low rumble shook the stones beneath their feet, and the shadows stirred. The greater force they had battled in the throne room had not vanished. It had retreated, but it had not abandoned its pursuit. Kaelin's hand tightened around his sword, but Lyra's presence calmed him. She raised her hands, sensing the patterns in the air, feeling the rhythm of energy that even the blind could perceive. "They watch," she said softly, "but they cannot touch what has been joined." Kaelin exhaled, realizing that the battle was more than physical. It was a trial of hearts. This force, this darkness, sought to exploit fear, doubt, and hesitation. And he understood, suddenly and fully, that Lyra's strength came not from magic or sight, but from her unwavering clarity of heart. They moved together, side by side through the shattered halls, their steps synchronized. The wind shifted, carrying whispers of what had come and what might follow. Shadows lengthened and twisted, yet neither faltered. They were no longer a king and a blind Omega. They were two souls moving as one, balancing each other, complementing each other's strengths and guarding each other's vulnerabilities. Kalen glanced at her, his eyes reflecting awe. "You are more than I could have imagined," he said quietly. "Not just in power, in courage, in everything." Lyra smiled faintly. "And you, Kalen, are more than the world has allowed you to be. You carry strength, yes, but also fear. And yet, you move forward anyway." Their words were simple, but heavy with meaning. Each recognized the other's flaws, their hidden pain, and the walls they had built around themselves. And yet, instead of retreating from those truths, they embraced them, understanding that true power lay not in hiding, but in facing them together. A distant shadow moved again, larger than before, its presence a silent threat. Kalen stepped protectively in front of her, but Lyra stopped him, placing her hands lightly on his chest. "Trust," she whispered. "They cannot harm us if we move as one." Kalen hesitated, then nodded. He had been a king all his life, ruling with command and fear, yet now he realized that the greatest strength was trust. Trust in someone else and trust in himself to act not out of pride or dominance, but out of unity. The shadow surged forward, and together they met it. Kalen's sword struck where he could, guided by Lyra's intuition. Her hands traced arcs in the air, pushing back darkness with movements that were as much heart as they were magic. The creatures recoiled, uncertain against the bond they could not understand. For every strike Kalen made, Lyra's insight anticipated the next move. For every advance of the shadows, their combined presence held firm. And in that moment, Kalen understood that the throne he had once clung to, the crown he had carried as his armor, had never been as powerful as the connection he now shared with Lyra. The largest shadow, ancient and patient, finally faltered. It hesitated, recoiling from the light that Lyra radiated and from the courage in Kalen's heart. Together, their strength illuminated the hall, and the darkness could no longer advance. Kalen lowered his sword slightly, breathing heavily. "It is done," he said, though even he knew it was only a temporary victory. Lyra's hand found his, steadying him. "For now," she said softly. "But we have learned the truth. Alone we would fall, together we can endure." They moved to the center of the hall, where the sunlight now broke through the clouds, casting long, gentle beams across the rubble. Lyra's blind eyes lifted slightly, and Kalen saw the faintest glimmer of light reflecting in them, not just from the sun, but from something deeper, something shared between them. "You saved me again," Kalen whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Lyra shook her head. "No," she said, her tone firm yet tender. "We saved each other, and in the process we have become more than we were." Kalen's hand brushed her hair back gently, the touch careful, reverent. "You have changed me," he said, almost in awe, "in ways no crown or command ever could." Lyra smiled faintly, and for the first time, Kalen saw the Omega not as someone to be protected or commanded, but as a partner in every sense. She was equal in courage, equal in vision, equal in strength, equal in heart. They stepped closer, the ruins of the palace surrounding them like witnesses to their journey. Kalen reached out, taking both her hands in his, and for the first time they did not dance alone together, their steps intertwined in a rhythm older than kings or kingdoms, older than fear, older than time itself. Their dance was quiet, yet powerful. It was not a dance of motion alone, but of hearts, of trust, of redemption. Every movement spoke of trials faced, lessons learned, and fears overcome. They were no longer a king and a blind Omega. They were two souls united, walking forward together into whatever future awaited them. Even as the final shadows of the night fled, a faint whisper lingered in the corners of the palace, a reminder that the world held more mysteries, more challenges, more trials. Yet Kalen and Lyra faced it with a bond unbroken, their hearts aligned in courage and understanding. The ruins glowed softly with the first light of dawn, and Kalen held Lyra close, their foreheads touching. "We are stronger together," he said softly. Lyra smiled, leaning into him. Always, she replied. For the first time in the kingdom's long history, the Alpha King and the blind Omega faced the day not as ruler and subject, but as equals. And in that equality, they found redemption, hope, and a love that was not fragile but forged in fire, shadows, and the courage to trust each other completely. The wind whispered through the broken towers, carrying the promise of a new beginning. And though challenges would come again, Kaelin and Lyra knew one truth above all. They would face them together, side by side, heart to heart, moving as one. The kingdom's scars remained, but in the center of it all, a new light had emerged. A light born of trust, courage, and the bond between an Alpha King and the blind Omega who had dared to dance alone, until she no longer had to. The story of the Throne of Thorns had reached its end, but the story of their hearts, their redemption, and their unity would continue, forever bound in the rhythm of a shared destiny.